my real interest is in occupational mental health. So although I'm a psychiatrist and I see a wide range of people with mental health difficulties, I lead for the Royal College of Psychiatrists and for the World Psychiatric Association, which sounds far more exciting than it is, on mental health in the workplace. And because of my military, I was in the Royal Navy for 23 years, my military background, I know a little bit about the sea, I suppose. There are many different sorts of reasons why people might develop mental health difficulties. You've heard about some of them and I won't go on at length. But I think one of the things to remember is that although the workplace absolutely can be challenging, we shouldn't forget that home life also has a huge impact. Certainly when I was the visiting psychiatrist for British troops in Afghanistan, and I'd go out regularly, although there were many cases of my buddy died in my arms and I saw this terrible situation, a lot of it was me and my partner don't get on, we got financial difficulties, my kid's ill, all that sort of stuff which goes on even when you are at sea. There's also this topic of moral injury, which is talked about more, I think, since COVID, although it's been around for a long time. And what it describes is being put in situations where often there is no right answer, where your moral or ethical code has been challenged. So you're asked to do something and it doesn't really sit well with you. A classic example from the pandemic was intensive care nurses, where normally they would give fantastic care to one patient on a regular basis, but during the pandemic they were asked to give the same level of care to 6 patients because everyone was very busy. And you just can't do that, so you get put in these impossible positions. And sometimes for seafarers, you have to go away because you've got to earn your money, but at the same time there are things going on at home which really you feel that you should be there too, and there is no easy answers. And moral injury can leave you in this state where, although you're not frankly ill, you haven't got a diagnosable mental health disorder, you keep going over it again and wondering whether you did the right thing. And moral injury can occur in 3 ways. First of all, acts of commission, so things that I did or other people did. Acts of omission, I just stood back and let things happen. And also feeling betrayed. And certainly in most organisational settings, including maritime, a lot of people do feel let down by either their bosses or by the company or by the environment. This is a big study we've got with healthcare workers, about 25,000 healthcare workers. And the reason I put this up is these 3 sort of clusters are healthcare workers who are exposed to low, moderate and high levels of these morally ambiguous situations. And there's 4 different ways of measuring mental health there. And the reason I put it up is to show it's the people who get frequently exposed to these difficult, morally ambiguous situations that have the highest risk of mental health difficulties. So if you have a lot of people on your vessel saying, it's not right, this should never have happened, I should never have been asked to do this, underneath that is probably some level of mental distress and in some cases mental ill health as well. And certainly this, again, forgive me, this is healthcare professionals because I don't have huge samples of seafarers, but often the biggest cause of moral injury is feeling betrayed, feeling let down, that people paid no interest in you when really that was their job. Although obviously we're here to talk about sort of mental health difficulties and mental health conditions, this is a study done by the ITF and also Yale University, which you'll be aware is quite a good university, back in 2019. And I think it's worth pointing out that actually many seafarers say they're actually doing pretty well, which perhaps isn't surprising, otherwise the whole situation would have fallen apart, wouldn't it? But we shouldn't forget that although mental ill health does affect an important minority, it is a minority. Most people actually are doing okay. What I think I quite like this graph about, it's about just over 1,500 people, seafarers, about when mental health difficulties might come. And actually, you can see it's often towards the end rather than in the middle. And this is actually remarkably similar to what we find in troops who deploy for many months at a time, that it's as you're coming to the end and it's the transitions that are the most difficult. So getting into it, and once you're in it, you travel along and you keep going, and then you have to sort of return home and reintegrate into whatever your family life might be. So it's worth thinking about that it's not just being at sea or not being at sea. There are bits of the deployment cycle that are more challenging. Just some mental health statistics from sort of the literature. You can see the first one is about really suicide in terms of nearly 6% of seafarer deaths were thought to be due to suicide in this particular study. That is very high. There is no two ways about it. If you take, say, the UK population, the suicide rate usually expressed per 100,000, between 10 and 12, and so per 100,000, and so 6% is a lot. Obviously, what that doesn't tell us is it's not 6% of seafarers, important to say, it's 6% of seafarers who die. And of course, you're probably aware, for people under the age of 40, suicide and accidents are the two most common reasons why people die. It is a common cause of death in people of working age. There's also the second bit there is about people missing at sea. Obviously we don't know why people are missing at sea, but there is certainly a hint there of suicide. And again, the last study there in 2012 showing 12% had thoughts of suicide. Although that actually sounds worrying, and it is, but if you look at a study, and we've done plenty of study on healthcare workers, 13% of student nurses have thoughts of suicide on a regular basis. So, in some groups, this is not uncommon. And of course, I don't need to tell you, but being at sea also is a dangerous environment. Forgetting suicide, accidents happen, and people do get injured and killed. We did a review recently, which we published last year, on the psychological risk factors for developing mental health problems at sea. We reviewed 63 studies, so we tried to take the whole literature out there and look about what had happened. And you can see I've listed there the main risk factors, many of which you can't do a lot about. The fact is, single people, you couldn't say, well, we're only going to recruit married people. That would be ridiculous. Or younger people, we're only going to recruit married, older people. These things you can't do a lot about. But the things like poor sleep, feeling unsafe, poor team cohesion, those are areas where you could make a difference. And so I think the modifiable risk factors are what I would be thinking about as intervention points. But also the other way to think about it is the people who are the most vulnerable are likely to be the single people who have not been there for very long. And we find that in loads of environments. We do work with diplomats, and it's the people who deploy on their first time, who haven't been to those environments before, who are the most at risk. And so all that means is, if you were the sort of senior people on board the ships, or if you were the employing company, you would want to pay special attention to those people rather than not employ them. The World Health Organization produced a great guidance document last year on mental health at work. It wasn't just about seafarers, it was general. And this is their kind of idea, is that you want to prevent, promote and protect and support. Going back to last speaker about what was said, this is a study for military personnel. We asked them when they came back from deployment, who did you speak to about your experiences? It won't surprise you to know that 97% said, I spoke to people just like me. That's the most common source of support. Although families are pretty high as well, as you can see. Even if you have counsellors or therapists or whatever you might have, most people don't use health and welfare setups. So it's important you have them there, but you can't think of that as a source of support. That's really a source of care. In terms of where do seafarers get their help from, this is a study, and again it fits in there that mostly it's friends and family. Although I do think it's quite interesting how, fitting with the last speaker again, nobody comes up higher than any other particular group as to where help is got from. What we know from the military is that actually the best place to get support actually is from your immediate supervisor. So it's not necessarily talking about the skipper or the boss or the senior person. It's if you're on lower decks, it's the person who's your immediate supervisor. That's the most critical person for you in terms of your mental health. So this study, you can see with the graphs, is of about 1,500 British personnel who are in Afghanistan. Just less than 3% of them overall probably have PTSD, which is not surprising, they're in a war zone. But the group who is very low, they thought their immediate supervisor was good and supportive and looked out for them. And the group that were very high thought their immediate supervisor had no interest in them and would take on extra duties to make themselves look good at the expense of others. There's a 10-fold difference in the rates of probably having PTSD between thinking your immediate supervisor is looking out for you and not. That's a very dramatic difference. The other little study down there, which comes from Australia, firefighter managers, what they did there was to train up firefighter managers, half of them, how to have what we call a psychologically savvy conversation, to be able to speak about mental health with their teams. For those of you who don't know, Australian firefighters, probably not the most psychologically minded people that you might come across. And they did a 4-hour training package, training up these fire station managers to use a particular model of having a good mental health conversation. They measured sickness absence in the 6 months beforehand and 6 months afterwards. That was their outcome. And they published it in a British journal, a good one called The Lancet Psychiatry. And they found for every £1 invested in that training, it saved £10 in sickness absence over the following 6 months. And that was what's called a randomised controlled trial. So that's good science. That's a really good science. So it goes back to the return on investment there. And the intervention is training up your managers to be able to feel confident to speak about mental health. So when the pandemic kicked off, we got asked to do a lot of work with healthcare workers. I set up the mental health strategy for the London Nightingale Hospital, which thankfully didn't run for too long, but it was there. And we trained up a lot of NHS supervisors how to have psychologically savvy conversations. Everyone was very busy, as you'll remember, in the beginning of the pandemic. So basically, we did a 1-hour training, which we initially did face-to-face, but then switched to Zoom. So in 1 hour, we did a small bit of, here's how you have a conversation, here's a demonstration of how you do it, and then we got people in breakout rooms practicing on little scenarios. An hour, that was all it was. We measured supervisors, these are the people who came on the course, we measured their confidence in identifying, speaking with and supporting their colleagues. Before the course, over half of them didn't feel confident to do those. 1 month after the course, nearly 85% felt confident. That's a 1 hour bite-sized training, really improves confidence to have those conversations. Another thing that makes a big difference is peer support. We've already said, that quote that came out quite nicely, I wouldn't tell anybody if I had a problem because they wouldn't like it. But actually people do speak to their mates, they do speak to their colleagues. And so peer support has a big role in many, many trauma-exposed organisations. This is what's called a Delphi study. A Delphi study is where you take lots of experts and you try and get them to come up with a consensus view on on a particular topic. And this topic is, what should peer support do in high-risk organisations? And these are the consensus views of what peer support should do. It should be someone who can listen to you, not a surprise. They should be able to give you some advice about basic interventions. This is not talking about psychotherapy, this is talking about problem solving and simple things. They should identify who needs to get professional help and they should be able to nudge them towards getting it. And this is important because although we think about fires and crashes and other sort of big things, that's what we call type 1 traumas. So a type 1 trauma, the big incident, would take someone who's doing okay, and then it might be just a few days later that actually they're smelling of alcohol and not sleeping and shouty. Hopefully you would spot that. But what often happens in difficult environments is people get multiple what we call type 2 traumas. These are often a lot smaller. And so people gradually go downhill over a while. And then someone says, right, do you know what we're going to do? We're not actually going to dock over there. We're going to move on. We're going to miss one of our stops. And the person goes, that's it, I'm out of here. And you think, well, that's a bit strange. I know it's a bit stressful, but it's not that bad. And actually the reason that they kind of appear to break, it's this straw that breaks the camel's back, is they've been going gradually downhill. And every time someone says to them, how are you doing? What's the answer? They say, I'm fine. And you know what FINE stands for? Which is fucked up, insecure, neurotic and emotional. Well, of course, it could mean that. But actually, when you've asked someone how they're doing and they say they're doing fine, you have not done a mental health check. And so it's important that if you are going to have a conversation, you have to get beyond fine, because otherwise you don't spot that people gradually go downhill. And one of the ways of getting peer support in place is through a program like TRIM, which stands for Trauma Risk Management. I have a conflict of interest. I'm one of the designers of TRIM and I sell lots of TRIM. This is not the only way of providing peer support, but this is a model that has lots of evidence. And What TRIM does is it takes people who are volunteers rather than voluntold to go on a 2-day training course so they can understand a little bit about psychological trauma, but that they feel confident to have one of these conversations with a colleague who might have been through a challenging time. And the TRIM checklist, this is what they use, looks at these risk factors. And TRIM practitioners are not diagnosticians, they're not clinicians, so no one's going to give you a diagnosis. But we know that the more of these risk factors that people are exposed to in a difficult and challenging workplace, the more likely they are to have a problem. So for instance, people who spend a lot of time blaming other people, or who feel ashamed about what they've done, or who aren't getting social support, or who are drinking heavily, all those things are identifiable in a confidential chat with a colleague, and the more that they have, the more likely they are to have a problem. TRIM practitioners don't go around giving people group hugs, that's not meant to happen anyway. They don't use scented candles. This is very much going back to, or at least, anyway, let's not talk about that. But the key point here is we already know people speak to their colleagues, so why wouldn't we put our detection system in the colleagues that they speak to? And that's what TRIM does. In the UK, we have guidelines on the management of lots of conditions through an organisation called NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And what NICE say is if people are exposed to trauma, they should be actively monitored. Active monitoring is the first. You shouldn't be diving in with mental health professionals, you should be actively monitoring people, and this is what TRIM does. But what you shouldn't be doing, this is a nice slide, is you should not be doing psychological debriefing. So if you do have a major incident, or if you have got a high threat environment, what you don't want a lot of people like me going out and talking to people who've been through trauma. Now, it might sound to you, that might sound a bit strange, because you might think, well, actually, if someone's been through a lot of trauma and they're distressed, surely they need a mental health professional. And the answer is they absolutely don't. The role for people like me is if they go through a trauma, they become distressed and they don't get better, and they're unwell and they develop PTSD or depression, then there is a role for a clinician. When you do studies where you take 1,000 people, 500 who've been through trauma, who then get counselling or trauma therapy or debriefing, and the other 500 who don't, the 500 who don't do better. And the reason is that clinicians like me are very good at dealing with patients who are ill. That's our job. What we try and therefore do is to use a clinical model on people who are normally distressed. It is very normal when a loved one close to you dies that you become distressed, or if there's a bad accident and someone's badly injured, you don't sleep well for a few days, or you have some intrusive thoughts. There's nothing pathological about that. That is a completely normal reaction to an abnormal event, and what we shouldn't be doing is medicalising that by getting clinicians involved too early on. I do lots and lots of medical legal cases where people sue their employer, and it is beginning to happen now that people are saying, you brought in a counsellor afterwards, you shouldn't have been doing that because that makes you worse. We've known this since at least 2005. The first NICE guidelines on trauma came back in 2005. So if you're an employer now and your response to a major trauma is let's fly out a team of counsellors, well, it's been about 18 years that we've known that that's not a good thing to do. So it's going to be pretty hard to defend if that's your approach. So what is good is to have a supervisor or a manager who knows how to manage people who are a bit distressed. And the principles here are what are called the PIES principles, which are nothing to do with leek and bacon or anything to do with that stuff. PIES is really common sense management. The study here is from the Israeli military. After the first Lebanon War of 1982, they had lots of people who were acutely distressed, not surprised, they were in a war zone. So they put in place the PIES principles, which I'll run through in a second. And the more the PIES principles put in place at the time that someone was distressed, the better they were 20 years later on. I can tell you, you don't get many 20-year follow-up studies. So P stands for proximity. And what proximity means is if someone's having a tough time, don't say, well, go home, we don't want to see you. Because that removes them from their social support, that we know helps, and it also really damages them. Now, if they're running around with a knife saying, I'm going to kill people, then you need to send them home. I'm not suggesting never send them away. But for most people who are normally distressed, the best thing you can do is to increase the support and temporarily reduce the pressure. Those are things that managers and supervisors can do. In the First World War, the phrase was, keep them within the sound of our own guns. maybe that's not very applicable these days. Keep them in the sound of our own mobile phones or whatever or engine spaces. But keeping them close, supporting them and temporarily reducing the pressure is much more likely to get them back to full fitness than saying, oh, look, you look distressed, why don't you just go away? Immediacy says that we know most people with mental health difficulties unfortunately don't come and get help. So immediacy says we should be using peer support or supervisors to have proactive, psychologically savvy chats. Because if someone's got a problem and we can solve the problem, it then doesn't become a mountain in the end. And if you look at the data about people who do present with PTSD or with depression, it's often really late. And by the time they present, they've not only got PTSD, they've also been drinking a lot. They've told their boss what they think of them, which probably isn't such a good idea. They've lost their self-esteem, they've miffed their family off. And then you haven't just got the trauma to deal with, you've also got all the rest of the secondary impacts. So if you can deal with things early on, that makes a huge difference. Expectancy says if we've got people who have gone through challenging and difficult times, we expect them to have some symptoms. If your sleep's a bit disturbed after a traumatic event for a few days, there's nothing abnormal about that. That's absolutely normal. If you can't stop thinking about it for a few days, that's absolutely normal. So you can say, gosh, that is terrible. The chances are you're going to be okay. But the other bit of expectancy is if you're not okay, we're going to make sure you get the help that you need to get you back on your feet. And the last thing is simplicity. And simplicity says that, it's a great adage, is that people in crisis problem solve badly. So how many times you can't find your car keys, you check your pocket and it's empty and you go around the house and you can't find them, but you check your pocket again, don't you, just in case they've appeared. We all do slightly silly things when we're stressed, that's normal. And so having someone who's not stressed, who can listen to you and go, well, actually, don't check your pocket, why don't we check where your keys were yesterday, and can often make a huge difference. The Americans have got a great phrase in the military, which is, if you're really distressed, 3 hots and a cot, 3 good meals and a good night's sleep is often the best form of psychological first aid. How many times do you go to bed worrying about 100 things? You wake up in the morning and you can't quite remember what it was you were worried about. So some simple things can make a huge difference, particularly when people are having a tough time. And then in terms of trauma or difficult exposure, what we shouldn't do is to forget this concept which is called post-traumatic growth. Back in, I'm not a philosopher, but Nietzsche had this phrase, was anything that doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I'm not sure I fully subscribe completely to that, but the fact is most of us develop in our lives and gain resilience by going through adversity. And actually when you ask 6,000 British troops who come back from Afghanistan about the lasting impact of it, well over half of them say, I think I actually did pretty well. If I can cope with that, when the 2-for-1 deal's gone in Tesco's, that's not so bad. And so actually, and again, even in healthcare workers, although the current sort of media representation is of everyone falling apart, we've got this sample of 25,000 healthcare workers. Many of them after COVID said, do you know what? I wasn't sure I could cope with it, but actually I think I did pretty well. That's not a story that gets out enough. So we shouldn't forget this concept that actually if you go through tough times, your ship's crew can actually use that as a way of enhancing resilience rather than let's just avoid people becoming unwell. So how might you do that? Well, you want to say thank you lots. Most organisations have a very good system of saying when things aren't right. We don't do enough of saying when things are right. So you want to say thank you lots, you want to write to people, you want to include families if you can, which all sounds pretty silly, but actually these things make a difference. During the pandemic, some of the hospital trusts that did well wrote to the children of the staff who were coming in saying, thank you very much for letting your mum and dad come to work, because I know it's really tough, but we really need them and they're doing a great job and we really appreciate it. How much effort did that take, and how much does that include them in there? It's simple stuff most of the time. Make sure people do take their leave. There's no problem in people working a bit of overtime, but if you end up working every day forever, guess what? It's not good for you. When you've been through a tough time or a tough period of time, often organisations do like an after-action review where they look at what went wrong, how do we stop this happening again. That's fine. What they don't do is talk about the impact, the emotional impact of it. And so reflective practice is about sitting down if you've gone through a difficult event and not just talking about what went right, what went wrong, but how hard it was. And actually, if you're a very junior member of the crew, and actually your boss can say that they found it hard, which might sound a bit kind of hard to do, actually it really, really helps. because you realise it's not just you. And what you're trying to do here is to create what we call this meaningful narrative, which is a story that doesn't end up with it's all your fault or it's all my fault. It ends up with this slightly cheesy phrase, which even if we weren't on the same boat, which obviously in this case they probably are, we're absolutely in the same storm. And actually that really helps people go, well, it wasn't right, but I can understand why it happened, rather than it's them and us, which isn't very useful. Supervisors, very good evidence that supervisors who have what we call health promoting leadership, whose first questions aren't why did you do it, but the first question instead is how are you? That sort of approach makes a much useful impact on and reduces the chance that staff suffer with mental health problems. If you've got people who have been through challenging times, I mentioned that term active monitoring, that's what you want to do for the first month or so after trauma before wading into any mental health support. And then if you do send someone to get any mental health care, and you absolutely should if they've got a problem, you want to make sure that care is what we call occupationally focused. And that basically means that the clinicians you should use shouldn't just be saying, let's get your symptoms better. They should be also talking about how do we keep you at or get you back to work. I do stuff to do with hostages who get detained for one reason or another and they come back. And one of the things we very quickly do in the days when they come back is to talk about getting back to work, even if they've been detained for 3 years. And that might seem a bit strange, but we want to be introducing that sense of getting back to normal life, not living. I've been a hostage. You want to define yourself by things that you want to do, not things that have happened to you. So you want to make sure that the services that you use have a back to work as one of their focuses. So overall, we shouldn't over-medicalise normal distress. Distress is normal in many areas of life. Mostly it gets better by itself. It really benefits from having a nip-it-in-the-bud approach, from having good supervisors and good colleagues. Those PIES principles are evidence-based ways to try and keep people going and get them back to work. And we shouldn't forget that we don't just want to avoid mental health difficulties, although we do. We want to try and encourage growth, psychological growth, which actually happens most of the time anyway. That's me. I'll happily take any questions.